as I'm speaking, if you were speaking right now and we brought up larynx, I think most of us are going to become aware of the voice box, the timbre of the voice, whether or not a person's tone of voice tells you almost 60% about what they're saying compared to the words they're saying. If you include body language, tone of voice, not just tone of voice, but facial expression, mannerisms and stuff, you're getting about 85% of their meaning. And in fact, you could probably watch, a TV show and turn the sound off. And just based on all of that movement, you can get a sense of that. If you didn't know the language they were speaking, but turned the volume back on and could hear the way they're talking, then you would be like, oh, okay, that's saying a lot. And I want to just come back to something. Many aspects of this are shorthand on a treasure map to bring your awareness to a relationship that's much bigger than what the finger is pointing at. So when we speak to the larynx, one thing, and again I'm mixing some modern understanding with ancient perception, there's a part of your stress physiology we call your polyvagal nervous system, which has kind of three different interactive ways of being in the world. And as babies, we actually regulate or dysregulate to the people around us in our nervous system, our kidneys, our daimai, our belt meridian, based on their facial expression, their body language, and their tone of voice. So one thing that we're invited to do in practice is to notice how much we actually respond, react unconsciously to the way people express themselves, or how conscious or unconscious we are in the way we express ourselves, and how we speak, and how we breathe, and all of that. So when we bring up the attention of the larynx, one thing, this is where we are in the body, right there. What are all the things that happen there with us? What are all the things that happen there with other people? And how do those things change the trajectory, let's say, the net casting, let's say, the mill of dreams and other things of our practice? And it just really implies noticing self-regulation and noticing how sometimes we have to self-regulate, down-regulate after interacting with people that might be very manipulative, very dangerous, very authoritarian. I think of medieval China and, the power over, power under dynamic, and what it would be like as a wandering Taoist ascetic or hermit in a world where it's obey or else. And that's true around the world throughout human history. But it does bring up this interesting opportunity for awareness around how communication happens and how communication is experienced by us as individuals, and how we can use that to come back into state, to recapitulate anything that we have said or we have had to deal with other people in the way they have communicated with us. So as we enter into practice, that social forward part of our experience that's very instinctual, we form these things as babies, can be attended to. And as we move more and more forward, we're going to be noticing we're moving more and more into what we call the horizontal world of interaction, being, meaning, ethics, society, and the kind of care and feeding of humanity. Whereas a lot of the things that have to do with up and down have to do with what is consciousness, what makes consciousness possible, can we make those connections, and return to the source of consciousness more than just run around with a flashlight hoping we don't trip and fall on the things we don't see. So that's something to consider with why the larynx is on here, and why that might be something that mediates or separates us from actually being completely conscious as we move forward into the way we interact with the world around us as beings. In China, in Taoist practice, maybe more in Confucian practice, we have the sansai, the way of heaven, the way of beings, and the way of kind of being in the body, in the animal world, in the feeding and excreting and sleeping and things like that. So in that way of beings, that horizontal path of cultivation, how we interact as a relational being, how we experience our life as a relational being, determines who is the one meditating. So opening to that, restoring that, maybe seeing a somatic therapist for a year to just unravel maybe what happened when you were from 1 to 3 years old, what happened during high school that formed your interactive conscious and unconscious behaviors. Because we're here to bring the unconscious into consciousness, which is how we heal the one meditating, so that we don't need to work on the one meditating, so we can just be meditating. So one other part to this that I find really quite interesting to share with people, because I don't think it's really spoken to in any way that I've seen to in the general conversation about this document or about Taoist practice, has to do with your trachea, or what is called the 12 floors or stories of a pagoda, or a pagoda that sits with 12 stories. Now, in the Yida Huanyuan tradition, which again is a healing tradition around Chinese medicine and how spiritual practice is a healing practice before it's truly a spiritual practice, there's some things that we do with what are called yuan xin, or innate minds or capacities of consciousness, that have to do with the way we speak, as I had just alluded to previously, but also our facial expressions, and more importantly than the details, how we form and put our ego out there to get our needs met, to move the world around us, to do the things that we do, and how becoming conscious of that and removing the egoic layers in many ways, so we can be our authentic self, our Chen Ren, our authentic human being, is a process. And depending on the training you're doing, maybe there is a sequence to that, or again maybe there's some kind of like embodied therapy that we could engage in to unravel those things. But the energy that's moving into those unconscious and perhaps conscious bits of trickery that the ego uses to get by, to get met, to get attention, to get accolades, or whatever, obviously needs to move away from the one meditating. And we can still use, the way the ego can play with being social to move through situations. That doesn't make us a bad meditator or somehow broken. It just means that we're being socially malleable. But when we drop into meditation, it's not a social thing anymore. So we want to move beyond the urgencies to perform socially, be met socially, be respected socially, because we're moving before that need, or below that need. Now, what's interesting also to consider here, and this is me kind of leading us to something important, it's a 12-story pagoda because you have 12 ribs, and the way you hold your chest, the way you open the space between all of your ribs while you're breathing, while you're moving, how open all of your intercostal muscles are, or how held and constrained your intercostal muscles are, is the cage, the prison, or you could say the lotus flower that contains your heart. So if I'm, moving through life and I have to be, separate and defiant and, against and that's the one meditating. And it's a felt sense within the chest. And you can see that with people, especially if you're in a qigong class, a tai chi class, or something like that. If you're a teacher, that's going to be one of those things we play with. Like when I previously talked about the principle of hen xiong, to carry what is being let go of in the chest with the diaphragm. That also is implied within the space between your ribs. So when we play with what's called Nei Jing Tu breathing, or the inner stretching kind of vessel of all the membranes within the body of breathing, there's going to be a period of time with how you stack and unstack or inflate the space between the ribs that's going to determine very much your state of being, and again reorient yourself to something very emotionally and spiritually open. And you could say in one way this is sort of like a passing lane for some things. I don't mean that in a sense of spiritual bypassing, like everything's fine. But if you're working through a certain amount of somatic constraint or collapse in your chest, because life can do that, again, I'm speaking from a healing tradition, sometimes we have to work with state, sometimes we have to work with story, and that's why I always recommend seeing a therapist if you're going to go into meditation for a while. Sometimes we don't need to focus on the story as each individual story. We can realize where there's a bunch of stories that are held in the body, and then we can kind of reorient ourselves to the state of how we hold ourselves, say, between our ribs, as an example, diaphragm, solar plexus, butterflies in the stomach. When we shift our awareness to state, sometimes that can help facilitate or transform a lot of the stories, because we're not holding on to that meaning anymore, because we've changed the way we exist within the membranes of the body. Which, as a clinician, I wish there was some way to just inspire everyone to rehabilitate and re-inhabit all of their membranes and tissues, so that the way we embody memories can just let go of itself. But unfortunately, we are, as humans, part story, part state, left foot, right foot. We can't move ahead and if we have a need to work something out. So again, saying that as a clinician, if you think you can just sit in stillness and meditate through all of the existential pain, visceral pain that may be sitting in your body from things that have happened in your life, you might get lucky, maybe. My recommendation, again, is find a teacher, find a tradition, find a practice, work with these things in the sense of with them to move through them, and or work with professionals to help you in that way. So that takes care of the back of the neck and into the throat and coming into the face, which is qi ji, which kind of means qi wounds or effects that are still kind of resonating within the system of the body. And this has a lot to do with everything I've just spoken about. Because again, if the one meditating, the one articulating through the tongue, which we'll speak about for a few minutes, is urgent against kind of in fantasy land, not really taking care of all of the things that are necessary below this part of practice, that's where most of the qi deviations can happen, because our attitude to practice is not patient, mature, comfortable, playful, confident, imminent, in the way that where we're going would recognize. So it's kind of like a little dashboard light warning of how you approach this attitude and how your ego kind of attends to what this might mean to you is the lever point between healthy, long-term, don't know the answer, can't know the answer practice to I really want to be better, special, not something, more something, or whatever. And that's that pivot of now we might get into some trouble. Here we have jiang qiao, which can mean moving over a descending bridge, kind of like, I forgot what the name of that is, in the bridges where the kind of gate falls like that. And that's actually meant to be your tongue. So you've probably heard the expression in meditation practice that we want to hold the tip of the tongue up behind the soft palate so that the Dumai and Renmai are connected. In a way, that's true. There's a lot more going on with what we do with the tongue, or what we undo with the tongue, the directions we may or may not be using some mild pressure with the tongue to create different interactions and different outcomes, different experiences. And they're all very, very important, I would say. But the one thing that's being implied here that's a part of the most kind of common sense way of looking at this document is when you reach up with your tongue, sometimes you just hold it upwards for a while. Sometimes you move it around your teeth. Sometimes you clack your teeth. We'll talk about why people do that in the training part. But we're trying to build saliva so we can swallow the saliva. And again, the left brain says kidney Jing refined, come up spine, refined brain. Brain somehow produce refined saliva, swallow refined saliva, and around we go. And that's a funny way of looking at it, and I'm being playful and making that sound very literal, and I am kind of poking it with a stick because there is some things to say about swallowing saliva being a good idea, but that's not the kind of only thing that's going to limit or create the outcomes of your practice. Having said that, though, and reminding you there's a lot of different things we can do with the tongue that are important, when you swallow saliva, and maybe just take a moment, when you swallow saliva and you're sitting for a few hours and you do that anyway, what would happen if you followed that bolus of saliva through the peristalsis of your esophagus into your stomach, and then decide to imagine, because we don't have a lot of sense nerves down here, because if we did, we'd kind of go crazy, but we can imagine that little bit of saliva sinking down and going down through the heart, doing the things that it might need to do there, which could be a lot, through the diaphragm, which is where one of the big passes, one of the big obstructions or narrow gates are, down into Dantian, which is an interactive relationship, not always a location. So this practice of unfurling the descending bridge so that the saliva can follow the tongue back and down, so we can follow with our sense perception. Our attention is now training itself to descend and stay tangibly connected. Membranes, energy centers, challenging places emotionally and instinctually and viscerally and intuitively, so that we can soften all of those places over time and actually keep sinking down the location of awareness into Dantian. Because it's one thing to say, okay, just sit and keep your awareness on your lower Dantian, and then we sit there with our flashlight staring at some imagined location in our lower abdomen. Might be a place to start, but there's a lot of things that need to happen for that to not be what we're doing, so that, again, the location of awareness resides in your lower Dantian. And that's months, maybe years, moving your location of awareness down. So that's something we're being invited to do, in this way. So I'll give one quick example of a thing you can do with the tongue because of what's coming next in the document. So if you hold your tongue up, the tip of your tongue to your upper palate, and there's stories about why that might be good. And then imagine the tip of your tongue has like Velcro to it. And this is always fun to do while I'm talking, but I'm putting my tongue to the roof of my mouth, feeling the Velcro connection between my tip of my tongue and the roof of my mouth. Relaxing the body of my tongue until it feels like my tongue body is hanging from the Velcro at the roof of my mouth. And then in whatever way, at whatever time, letting the tongue fall. And that's also what's implied by the descending bridge, is upward produce saliva, swallow saliva, release the tongue and the body and everything at once. Your tongue, from Chinese medicine point of view, is the butt of your heart. So if the butt of your heart, the flower of your heart, is holding up the roof of your mouth because of meridian connections, it's another flashlight pointing at something with anticipation or consequence, which is unfortunately the wrong part of the brain for where meditation needs to go. So it's meant to be kind of like a doorway. Lift up your tongue, make the connection, use the relaxation of the tongue as a way to relax the entire space and awareness of the heart, in all the ways we mean heart in Chinese medicine and Taoist practice. And when everything comes into stillness, the heart and the tongue descend into the floating return towards yin. We could say kind of the heart is now kind of floating on the ocean of the water of the kidneys in one context. So that's just an example of what we're doing with our tongue. When we get into the training part of this, there's a few other things to do. So the next thing here is, in Chinese, says, 闭眼呼声说错天. This translates as the blue-eyed foreign monk holding up the heavens. And that position here is a very ancient shamanic Taoist practice, which translates to the sky mirror, which relates to a certain part of one of the dantians in the brain when we get into that. So when we think of that sky mirror holding up the heavens, again, part of that could be construed to be the way we hold up the tongue to connect the meridians, because right here we have Dumai and Runmai connecting in a way, which I'll come back to. But the blue-eyed monk is an allusion to the person Bodhidharma, who came to China, a couple of thousand years ago and taught Buddhism in China. He's the person who is attributed, I think I guess this would have been 1,500 years ago maybe, who went and sat with the monks at the Shaolin monastery, or, depending on who you talk to, formalized the Chan, or seated meditation practice that was already existing in China around Buddhism in a way for those two cultures to interweave into each other. So there's a lot of things that are attributed to Damo or Bodhidharma. In China, the nickname is the blue-eyed foreign monk. Why are we upholding heaven, or why are we in the sky mirror? And again, we're at the front of the body, which is the social, relational Randa, the Tao of beings. So what does it mean to uphold the heavens? And I'll just speak to the sky mirror practice. So obviously we've probably never met. If I was to ask you to write a paragraph or two about what you believe from heaven downwards is going on, or what you believe other people believe is from heaven downwards, like what is the will of God? I'm not religious in that context, but I mean that's an interesting thing to think about. What is the will of God? What is Christ consciousness? What is Buddha nature? Some people take a Lao Tzu as kind of God in some way. What would Lao Tzu say? What would Jesus say? So we have an awareness that from an ethical point of view around religion, whatever the sky being or beings are suggesting we are like, or that may help us down here, perhaps that's the thing that we're meant to bring up and bring into our speech and bring into our mind and to actually mirror back. Because let's say, there's sort of a father-son, mother-daughter connection, parent-child connection between the sky and being human. If our parents say, this is the way to make the world better and to be better in the world, that's moral, ethical guidance. And we can say, no way, I'm going to go and do something else. Or we can say, I'll just fake it because I don't want to get punished, because that's how a lot of religions kind of do their business. Or we can say, I completely agree with you, and I'm going to mirror that in my behavior in the world and how I relate to things, but also in a celebration of humility and the sacred, and a kind of reverence for the what if the universe is conscious, and kind of hopes that we're going to show up in the best ways that we can. So this is our Buddha nature, aspiring to be Buddha-like. And the outcomes of that are in this part of the document here, which I translated in the overview, and I'll share that again in a moment. So as we're moving forward, we can see that we have Dumai and Runmai, the governing vessel and conception vessel that make up a big part of the reservoirs of your yin-yang potential. They're the result of the health of your internal organs and the meridians that relate to them. And that's why these little rainbows that are coming up through the tongue up into Ranmai, and from the structure of the body and mind downwards to where they meet, you can see there's 5 little rays in these rainbows of a meridian function and capacity. So the assumption is all of the yin and yang organs are in balance, in harmony, and full to the filling and almost overflowing with Jing Qi and all of the other things that are needed. So that's sort of the invitation here, as if you really want to interweave and connect and benefit from complete circulation between Dumai and Runmai. Complete circulation implies the completion of those meridians, not just the movement of a choo-choo train on a train track. And this is where the microcosmic orbit gets very misunderstood and misinterpreted in the West, because in the West everything is things and movement and stuff and accumulation and benefit and causality and all of that. So we want to think of the microcosmic orbit as moving chi up and down the body. Again, so when we are thinking about the potentials here, the microcosmic orbit, the way the tongue and the face interact, the way Runmai and Dumai may or may not be complete in their circulation, that's what's being suggested here. What's also being suggested, though, is the yin-yang parts of us are whole, or at least moving towards wholeness. And there's the up-down part, the vertical part of all Dantian that are iconic to the structure of the universe, yin and yang, north and south. The world pivots around north and south, right? If you spin a globe, there's an axis. So everything that's got to do with Dumai is the axis between the sky and the land. When we talk about Runmai, we're talking about the globe spinning around. right? So that's everything that's got to do with interaction down here on the land, or horizontal, as I've said. So we need to actually, in a way, fulfill all of those capacities, open all of those birthrights and aspects of our capacity as consciousness, as well as our organic, physical, physiological self, as well as our social self, for the Dumai Runmai circulation capacity to be whole. Think of this as an antenna. If your antenna is frail and covered in chunks of tinfoil or something like that, then you're going to get that kind of reception. If your antenna is something that's built over years and is very strong in its connection to the land and its ability to reach into the sky, remember that summit that's always reaching upwards. That's what the summit, the antenna, is made of. So not a lot of poetry describing that, just a reminder of what we all probably might have learned to fulfill whatever lineage of practice that you may have studied in, whatever process and progress that you are expecting to follow within the tradition that you've learned from. So I'll translate this once more in a more subtle way from the overview, and then we're going to move into the middle Dantian, which is a very, very important bunch of relationships to work with.